The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. We're back at a slightly more unusual recording time of a Friday. I don't know when you'll listen to this or when it'll actually be published, but what we have had is what should have been a 2-day Indy 500 Open test, which was shortened to one, which we'll talk about at length. We've also had the news that Prema Racing is joining the IndyCar series with 2 cars. We've got Long Beach coming up very, very soon. And we've also got a bit of a question mark over what's going to happen with one of the McLaren cars again. So that's another topic we'll get into on this week's show. Joining me is Hildebrand, who was at the test and has been working out with Josef Newgarden again. How was that? Did you enjoy it? Or did he put you to shame?
I feel proud that I'm not feeling completely like I got hit by a bus today. After working out with him yesterday. Yeah, I definitely gain a little advantage, or not advantage, but like I get a little help from otherwise training at like 6,000 feet that when I come down to sea level, I'm kind of in the window. But yeah, always a good time with Janu. You know, it used to be that I was better than him at everything. Now I'm just trying to, like, if I could be the guy that could hang on to his like coattails, I'm all right with that at the moment. So anyway, yeah, good times.
In the video you posted, he was stood up and you were sat down. So maybe just try standing up. Maybe
well, we did switch, Jack. Just yeah. But I was like, we did walk in, and I just jumped into his session in the morning with Jeff Richter, who's training. Trains Ed and Pato and Felix, and Jack Harvey's in there all the time. The guys that are based in Indy, there's a few of those guys that are in all the time, and like Josef and I are both on just a remote deal, and so we obviously, as has been noted on the pod before, we kind of have a little banter about various workouts. But yeah, I walked in and so it was basically the whole workout was set up for Josef, and I was just joining him, and Jeff's like, okay, we're going to do, trap bar deadlift. And we like lifted before we went and did this whole cardio thing. And he's like, how do you feel about, just like throwing 315 on the trap bar? I'm like, dude, I haven't seen that kind of weight on anything like in 10 years. So like, if you want me to also do this row ski thing and not be like dead in the water before we even get started, we might have to take something off. But he left it for me and just added weight for Josef, which like didn't help my cause at all. But anyway, yeah, just a day in the life of Superman's workout routine, basically. I'm glad I don't have to do that every day.
In the vein of the Race Josef Newgarden podcast, let's stick with him because we had a 2-day Indy 500 Open test lined up. It's if you're unfamiliar with this test, it's quite crucial because although a lot of the teams don't necessarily run the car that they're going to run at the Indy 500, there's a lot of setup and development work going on, a lot of chance to check some of the simulation you've been doing in the off season. It's a chance for the mechanics to get their eye in with pit stops and stuff like that. Just a general good opportunity for everyone to get into the swing of the 500. And unfortunately, one of the days was cancelled on the Thursday. So we had, luckily, IndyCar kind of predict this from the weather forecast and extended the Wednesday's day of running. So we did at least get an extended day on Wednesday, but the Thursday was cancelled. So we don't need to get too deep into this, JR, because we don't have a whole lot to go into. And as we've spoken about on previous open test pods, you can get down a rabbit warren of looking at which cars look good and which cars look bad. And then you look very silly by the time it comes to the Indy 500 because you've made predictions based on things that aren't representative. But Josef first, a good start for him. We've seen Penske be very good at these open tests before and then struggle across the course of the 500, but we'll hope for Josef's sake that this is a good start for him, obviously topping the test. And we had Kyle Larson in second, albeit with a massive toe. Still, nobody else, well, Josef Newgarden was the only person faster than him, so still a good lap thrown together there. And he seemed, hearing from him in the kind of post-test press conference, he seemed very, very relaxed, which kind of unnerved me a bit that, Obviously, it's not the first time he's been out on the speedway now, but this is, a proper in-track, in the swing of things, Indy 500 test where there's real like Indy 500 parts on the car and there's real kind of work being done towards the Indy 500 here. And he just seemed to just kind of take it all in his stride, which was pretty impressive. You were at the test, JR, so what were your kind of key takeaways? Was there anything that stood out to you, either from the guys who were kind of running at the front, or was there any cars maybe further back that you saw that you liked the look of? Just kind of intrigued about what you kind of saw trackside there and what was going on.
Yeah, I think, the only, and it's not because we're trying to like get more clicks or listens here, but the only thing that was actually particularly interesting to me was watching Kyle. And I say that mainly because for everybody else, there wasn't enough time, like hardly anybody made more than a few runs. And just kind of talking to guys up and down the paddock, like sitting in the pit lane, nobody really felt like they ended up getting much accomplished there. And there was a number of teams that were really bummed that they didn't get even just a little bit more time, because it kind of switched over to rookie or to ROP and refreshers, which did all get knocked out. So that's one thing that, basically besides, I guess we're assuming RC is going to be in the able car or whatever ends up happening there. All the ROP and refreshers are out of the way. That was frankly probably the most significant thing that actually happened on the test day, besides Larson getting a little bit more time in the car. For a couple of, and I say that for a couple of reasons. One, just because there wasn't a lot of track time, and then two, because the conditions it was so cool that it's kind of just like unrepresentative of like the cars are making a ton of downforce. Like it makes it, in those kinds of conditions, everybody will kind of feel like a bit of a hero. Like the cars just work better in traffic than they're going to, when the temps even just climb another 15 or 20 degrees or something. So I think in the big scheme of things, for most teams, they're not getting much out of it. I talked to even a couple of the folks at manufacturers and spoke with some of the teams. And I think the hope was that they'd get a little bit more time, kind of just to get a feel for, there were some development items that teams were wanting to work on. There were some things that drivers and team managers and engineers wanted to kind of just to your point, just to get a read on, not necessarily setup items, because that's sort of where the conditions are, play a little bit bigger role, but, trying to do some back-to-backs on either aero parts or, things that they'd kind of tweaked on in the wind tunnel or, on the manufacturer side, trying to get a little bit more of a feel for where the other manufacturer is at, just in terms of off-season gains, not that there's anything that they can do about it at this point. Like manufacturers are basically committed to the engine spec that they're going to roll out at Indy, but it does affect for anybody. And so we'll just talk about it in the context of Honda and Chevy, that, if you feel like you're half a step up or half a step down, that does maybe start to impact how you think about situational strategy coming back for the month of May. So, but basically for all of those conversations that I kind of briefly had with one person or another, they were basically like, it's kind of what we came here to do, and we didn't run enough to have any idea. The interesting thing I thought about Larson was basically just that, he sort of did just get stuck into running in traffic in some, not like a full on huge train of cars, but, it will, at least for him, going out there and at least just getting a little bit of a feel for that was like a huge gain to come back here in a month and actually just have that little bit of seat of the pants, like, oh, this is kind of how the steering wheel feels when I get close to a car through turn 4, and that and with TK looking out for him, he'll be able to make really good use of even just that 1 or 2 laps that he was running close enough to somebody that it kind of changed the way the car felt, and be able to that'll like register as something valuable to him going forward.
He said in the post-race press conference, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he was like, on fresh tires in traffic, he was like, "Oh, this is easy. Like, what's the big? Why have people been telling me that this is difficult running in traffic? Like, this is easy." And then he'd got to like the end of a set and was like fighting for his life basically at the end of those stints, and I think really got a flavour for what makes the Indy 500 so tough and some of those difficulties. Obviously, we had him on the pod, so if you've not listened to that interview, go back and find it. We interviewed Kyle Larson at length on the podcast. Definitely check it out. It was really interesting. Do you think, JR, that just like based off of those experiences that you've seen him talking on, obviously lots of different times, not just on the pod, do you think finishing second in the test and the way the test played out for him will give him any sort of kind of boost or not extra motivation, because I don't think he'll need any extra motivation at this point, but do you think he goes away from this test thinking or at least feeling that a little bit more confident, or do you think he's the kind of guy that knows that a test like this is not going to make the difference between him winning the Indy 500 or not? I'm kind of interested in what you think his takeaway from this test will be.
My guess is that he treats ending up on the board in second the same way as any of us would if you're in a good car, which is that's basically like totally inconsequential, that these are all just tow times, and so it's kind of circumstantial, particularly on a short day, that you end up at the top of the sheet. You feel better about that than if you had ended the day 28th or something. But I guess in the big scheme of things, that'll be the thing that I think he probably forgets about the quickest. He'll be thinking more about what you mentioned, which is like, oh, what was this like at the end of a set of tires? And like, this was actually really hard. And trying to just kind of feel into what that was like and start to think about like it's actually going to be like that more often than not. Certainly come race day, but probably even getting through practice. And I think that's the thing that'll probably stick with him is Kyle, just because of everything that he does, I would assume that he kind of has the expectation that he's going to sort of figure it out and be relatively competitive. He knows the value from all the other stuff that he's done, and certainly running for Hendrick and NASCAR. He knows the value of being in really good equipment. So he knows that he's got that underneath him. And so he's kind of like should be fairly competitive just from a pace and, whatever performance point of view. So again, I think that like when you're in those situations, he probably, in terms of where he ended up on the sheet, if you'd asked him where he was going to end up on the actual timesheet heading into the test, I don't think he would have told you that he thought he'd be in the top 5, but just because, but being up there, given what was going on at the test and all that kind of stuff, I doubt that completely shocks him. Like, it's not like, oh man, like I'm way ahead of the game here or something. He knows that there's a bunch of little things that he's got to figure out. And, he hasn't pitted off a 4 yet. He hasn't, there's a bunch of these things that that he knows, like he's going to have to figure out. And he's like behind on the learning curve for, that are going to factor into where he ends up on race day. And so I think my guess is that he's just already focused on that stuff more or less. And that's based on him obviously having some initial experience here, which is comfort and like a general understanding and kind of feel for what the car is doing. Like I think if there's anything that sort of comes from the test, it's that it would appear, at least so far, like his instincts for like just driving the car and driving a car of some variety, and how he would naturally just drive a fast car around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and his kind of natural reaction to, oh, it's doing this, so I'll adjust my line like this, or whatever, that more or less all of that stuff, as I would have expected, to be honest with you, but you never really know until he doesn't know until he actually shows up and starts doing it at, with other cars on track. You don't really know, like, if all that is going to click right away, or if that's a learning process all by itself. And so I guess I think that, my takeaway probably from the test watching him is a lot of this stuff clearly was fairly intuitive for him. And so now he's just got to figure out the other parts. Because like, especially given that the track conditions were actually quite good, you know, it, for anybody, you get to the end of a set of tires on like basically green track, even when the conditions are like that, it's going to start to not feel great, being stuck in traffic. And, I think that's the thing really that's like the hardest to get used to is, all right, like how hard can I continue to push? How do I have to prioritize like where I'm placing the car, what my closing rate is, the car in front of me going through the corner? I can be this close through 1 and 2, but I can be this close through 3 and 4, and whatever the wind direction, like all of these kinds of things, the way that they impact. He's used to he's like used to probably having to factor all that stuff in to some degree, but my guess would be that in the IndyCar, you have to learn to be a little bit more uh, like preemptive in your or proactive, maybe either word is probably true. You got to think a little bit further ahead um, than in other stuff that he's driven. So I think, and he even alluded to that a little bit, like just the checkups in traffic and all that kind of stuff. Like not that I think that was catching him off guard in terms of like reaction time or something, but just stuff starts to happen really quickly, and suddenly the track feels very narrow when you've got a couple of cars like slowing down right in front of you all of a sudden. Um, and so I think, my guess compared to a lot of the stuff that Kyle drives is that you sort of maybe can't be quite as reliant on just your reactions to stuff in an IndyCar, because you don't get, there's like not a lot of room for error. Like thing doesn't work when it's like you've got a lot of slip angle in the tires front or rear or whatever. Like it kind of just all goes numb. And that's the thing that takes a long time, particularly at the speedway in race trim, to really like trust and have a feel for. So
I'm kind of machine gunning you with questions here, but I'm enjoying the insight. So another thing that Kyle had talked about is not like taking advice from too many people. Basically, again, kind of paraphrasing him a little bit, but saying that he was taking advice from like the people who are close to him, like people like Tony Kanaan, who you mentioned, who's working very closely with him, but not paying too much attention to too many people out there. And that kind of stuck out to me because I feel like maybe it's not as simple as saying you get two different types of people, but you definitely get the people who are literally trying to get as much information as they can physically get hold of. They're speaking to every single person in the paddock if they could, trying to get every last bit of information that they can get to prepare themselves better. And not to criticize the way Kyle's doing it, it's just obviously a different approach, and he's trying to minimize the kind of irrelevant information maybe, or the information that doesn't quite apply to him in the same way. What do you make of his approach? And if you were him, would you be speaking to every single person in the paddock, or do you kind of like his approach of being a bit more kind of specific to the people who are relevant to you specifically?
I like his approach a lot, and that's partially just because he's got really high quality people around him.
Well, yeah,
like if he was
helps when you got that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I would guess that's a part of why he's approaching it that way. It's not like he would just do this no matter what, but he's got a former Indy 500 winner. He's got like 20 Indy 500s or whatever under his belt, and Tony Kanaan, who was in that car last year. So you don't need you really don't need more insight than that, plus the data and the other guys on the team that are also in your car and in this situation. So part of the reason I think that he's doing that, well, part of the reason is just exactly that he, by isolating yourself somewhat to that feedback only, you're removing a lot of variables, like other things that you might be accounting for that may or may not be relevant to the way that you're going to go about doing this. And so I think Kyle is in a position where he's earned the right. I'll give him this, that he's earned the right. I think in his head, he probably also thinks about it this way. Like, I've been so good in so many different things that I'm gonna allow myself to form my own hypothesis about like how to go do this. And then I'm gonna like take in feedback from the people that are immediately right here that know exactly what I'm dealing with They know this car specifically. They are all or are also driving a car that is exactly like mine. Same setup, same setup philosophy, at least same package, same build, same everything. Um, and sort of, be testing my theory, we'll call it. You probably don't think about it quite in those terms. It's not like he has like a literal theory in his head about how to drive the car. It's just his intuitive way of going out there and doing it, basically. The way that he would generally think about kind of input strategy and the way that you kind of handle different situations and whatever. And in essence, on kind of a case by case basis, be taking in feedback to compare and contrast against either the way that you are actually doing it, the way that you would think about doing something, whatever. And I'm sure he's also being proactive about, you know, being open to just taking general feedback and insight from those guys. But if you've got really high quality people around you, you will unquestionably be much more efficient at finding performance and solving problems if you can reduce the amount of inputs required to adequately address things. And so I think for him in this situation, it's absolutely the right move because he doesn't have a lot of time to screw around with stuff. So I think that's really the reason that this is the right attitude to have, is that even when you come back in May, like, yeah, you got a lot more practice than in other places, but it's still only like 3 days of practice before you go straight into qualifying stuff. And as happened here at the test, like days can get rained out. You got a lot of stuff to try to work through. There's a lot of just different elements of finding performance and being ready for qualifying, being ready for the race at a high level. So, by approaching it the way that he's approaching it, he's effectively, he might miss a tiny bit of like valuable feedback from somebody else. Like there's certainly other people that are outside of the core group of people that he's surrounded by that could give him very good information. But I think maybe to his point in talking about it, it's also very likely that you're getting a bunch of information that, whether it's better or worse or whatever, that you just don't need. And so by not having to filter through all of that, he's going to be able to just get with the program, stay focused on the on you know 95% of the time, be focused on like the right things just based on the feedback from the people that are immediately around him, and go from there. I mean, it's kind of like the types of things that stand out to me as like little bits of, it's kind of like, okay, like if you could go pick Scott Dixon's brain about qualifying, that would be worthwhile, right? Like there's nobody inside of McLaren that has had the success sticking cars on the pole at Indianapolis like Scott Dixon has had. Like there are some little things like Scott Dixon, 10 times out of 10 out qualified Tony Kanaan at the Speedway. But does that even matter in Larson's situation here, year one? Like, no. And he was basically teammates with Scott before. So if he needs to go find Scott to ask him a question, like, I'm sure he whatever, like they know each other already. So yeah, I think that's more or less. I guess I say that all just to say I think it's the right move because it'll help him be efficient at getting through stuff. Moving along, Prema. I had actually heard about this months ago. So interesting to just see it finally.
Ooh, don't you know lots of
finally
stuff?
Come through. I actually heard about it just because there were a few different teams that were looking at joining the IndyCar series, particularly when this whole franchise system started to become kind of a thing that started to accelerate some of those conversations, just depending on when that was going to be implemented and how you wanted to try to strategically get positioned for that. And so through that, I had understood who some of the players were, basically. that were trying to get involved, and that this in part comes down to engine leases. Like there are only going to be a certain number of engine leases available, regardless of what happens with the for full-time entries, regardless of what happens with this charter system or whatever we're going to call it. So which is still a little, undefined to this point. But anyway, yeah, cool to see this. Like in my mind, totally cool to see this completely come together. It was interesting being in the paddock. Especially a number of the European guys who have either raced for Prema or been around, their team, I guess, like through the European ladder, were spoke just incredibly highly of the organization, and in their minds how, I heard from multiple guys just totally unsolicited how big of a deal they thought it could be given the sort of presence that Prema has had on the European ladder for a long time. Like just the amount of not that it has anything to do with validation or credibility of IndyCar or any of that kind of stuff. They were talking about it more just from the context that like this is going to like leave the door more open to more guys, more really good drivers having like an access point into IndyCar. So that was kind of, in my mind, like one of the major takeaways, and also just goes to show, I think, very generally speaking, that like IndyCar, despite all of this charter talk and all the rest of it, is still clearly a place that for teams and sponsors and whatever, like still feels very accessible in a way that Formula One certainly just is not these days.
Just going back to what you were saying about drivers, I think there's very few teams out there where a driver might do one race or one championship with a team, and then 7 or 8 years later is still talking to that team just in like a friendly capacity without any kind of obligation to talk about a future drive or anything like that. It's literally just, and there's I could reel off at least 7 or 8 of those people from my experience of working in Formula 2 and Formula 3 around Prema, and Callum Ilot's one of them. He only did one season with Prema in Formula 3 in his junior career. So, and he speaks to Prema now still, even before, the IndyCar thing was a thing. He was still in contact with them a few years ago and still is now. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point to raise. It's a good sign of how well respected the team is. And what's amazing about Prema to me as a team is that it's a family started team that turned 40 years old last year. It was started by Angelo Rosin, and Rene Rosin's now the team principal, and they've kept that element of the family run aspect of the team, in the sense that it does look like a family when you see how it runs and how it operates. And hearing some of those stories from some of the previous drivers, it definitely feels like that kind of family atmosphere. But they've also turned that into an incredibly successful racing team that has won like 80 championships or something now over its 40-year history, which I think Jay Fry in the press conference noted that even his maths could work out that was pretty good. I'd be on Jay Fry's team with that one. Even my maths can work that one out. So yeah, a pretty exciting introduction to the IndyCar team, and a lot of uncertainty even from the people who maybe know Prema really well as to how this might go, because it's a big step, and we've seen big teams come from championships in Europe before, or European-based teams, let's say. Carlin, obviously a big example that people have kind of banded around in the wake of this news. That I think calling them a failure is harsh, but obviously are not in the IndyCar series now, so therefore found it difficult to establish themselves in this championship. So not that Prema are going to suffer the same fate as Carlin. I think they're better backed, they've got better resources, and I think they've been planning this, and they've got a long runway to get ready for 2025, that I think they'll have all of the kind of foundational pieces in place to make this work. So it's definitely an interesting team. As you mentioned, Chevrolet backed 2 cars for next year. I thought I could quickly run through some of the kind of key questions that people have been asking about this and maybe answer some of them. So I've seen a lot of people, and I was expecting this, to be honest, before the announcement came out, saying that this was basically going to be like a place to put their F2 drivers once they'd finished in F2, and Prema are very keen that that's not the case. They want to have an experienced driver in the team next year, someone with IndyCar experience, to be able to shortcut some of that learning and help them adapt to ovals because they've not done ovals before, obviously. But they've also not ruled out taking 2 rookies next year. They'll literally take whoever they think are the best possible drivers for them for next season. So that in itself, JR, I think is quite exciting, just from a team boss point of view, that they don't feel like they're in a box that they need to do something. They're just like, if we're going to have 2 rookies next year, then we're going to have 2 rookies next year. Like, that's just what we're going to do, and we're going to be okay with it. So that's quite exciting. The team will be based in Indiana, so they'll be close to that kind of hub of Indianapolis. They'll take some people from Europe. They're going to offer some of their key people the opportunity to move over to the States and be part of this. But the big kind of overriding thing that Prema are trying to get across here is that Pierce Phillips is in charge of the American program, and that they want this to be a team with an American heart, is the phrase that they used. So they definitely want this. They definitely want to build this team up like it's an IndyCar team, and not like it's a satellite team from a team coming from Europe. So that'll be interesting to see how that works. Ovals, they'll obviously be looking to hire some local engineers from Indianapolis as well. And Pierce Phillips said that his phone had already blown up after the announcement had been made with people looking for jobs and looking to get hold of it. They'll run 83, which is a nod to the year of their founding in 1983. And they're not currently planning to have an Indy Next team, which I found quite interesting, because when you think of Prema, you think of junior single-seaters and working with young drivers. So the fact that they won't have an Indy Next team immediately is kind of interesting, but also very wise, I think, because they're already biting off a big chunk of what they can do. I said earlier, it's a family-run team, and obviously it's expanded past that now to the point where they compete in Formula Regional, European, Formula 3, Formula 2. They're in prototypes now as well. They have karting programs. They're in Formula 4. Basically any junior championship you can think of, they're probably in it in a European context, and Asia as well. So they've definitely got enough on their plate that they can establish themselves in IndyCar before taking on an Index program. So yeah, I think that basically runs us through the Prema story, and it's definitely going to be interesting to see how they get on and how this team develops. I think on paper, I'm just so sure that they're going to make this work and be immediately successful, but there's so many different things that could get in the way of this kind of thing, that it's going to be really interesting to see how quickly. I basically have faith that they're going to adapt. It's how quickly they're going to be on the pace and fighting, and if they're going to attract some of these drivers that we expect them to, some of these top caliber drivers, then they're going to want to give those, well, just for their own sake, they're going to want to win, but they're going to have to give those drivers the equipment to go and do it as well. So that's going to be an interesting aspect of this story as well, I think. All right, so we should jump back to McLaren, JR. We were talking about Larson earlier, and I'm kind of very interested by this Theo Pourchaire story. So we're kind of along the same lines of sticking in Formula 2 at the moment, but Theo Pourchaire, the 2023 F2 champion, I almost said IndyCar champion then, has emerged as the favourite to take over David Malukas' seat for Long Beach, which is a very interesting story. So if you've been following this story, or if you haven't, obviously David Malukas picked up an injury from a mountain bike shunt before the season started and was expected to be back for Long Beach, but complications with his recovery has meant that he's not going to make it. It's interesting in 2 different ways. One, because Callum Ilott, who's replaced David Malukas for those first two races of the IndyCar season, has got a event in WEC, so he's going to be away competing, so he's not available, and it meant McLaren had to move quickly to replace him. And also it's interesting for another reason, because Barber comes up really closely after Long Beach, so McLaren's going to have to make a decision as to whether they keep Theo Pourchaire in the car, or if they try and drag Callum Ilott back over from his WEC ride for that Barber round, which he can do. He doesn't have a clash for it. So I don't know. We're going to have to speak to the team and find out, because I'm kind of wondering if Theo Pourchaire's amazing, then they'll keep him in the car for Barber. They might have already made the decision to keep him in for Barber just because it's easier from a point of view of having his seat in the car and just maintaining status quo there. So we'll have to ask the team and see what the situation is there. But JR, how difficult is it going to be for someone? I mean, we've talked about this at length on the podcast about drivers coming into IndyCar and how difficult it is. But how tough is it going to be to have your first drive of an IndyCar is going to be in a practice session at Long Beach, of all places? That I think for me that would be one of the last places that I would want to do this. So just from your experience, what do you make of this challenge, and I guess what are his expectations going to be, because that's a rough gig to start with?
It's definitely a tough, it's a very tough ask for sure. And McLaren knows that. And, I think that, I guess if this is not with any particular insight into anything, so you can just take this like at face value, but I'm inclined to sort of um, read into some of the chatter about this being like a long-term injury recovery situation for David. Like I don't personally get the feeling that this is something that's going to like resolve itself quickly with David back in the car anytime soon. um and that could be for any variety of reasons. But like I said, I don't know anything about this, like in terms of really anything that's like behind the scenes, but um, just kind of getting a vibe for like what some of the conversations are and that kind of thing. Like, and so I guess I bring that up mainly to say I think that if I'm McLaren in this situation, you're potentially trying to figure out what your plan is going to be for even like later in the year. And that I guess with that in mind, um, I guess it surprises me a little bit putting somebody who has as little experience in IndyCar as Theo does this early in the season, mainly just from the perspective that like that car being solidly in the points, I'm sure it does matter to McLaren. Maybe they're just confident enough that they'll be able to kind of make that happen come hell or high water, basically by the end of the season, that it's not of a significant concern to them. But particularly because you got to figure that that's kind of important, and that maybe they're looking at, maybe they're trying to figure out next year where they're going to sit in some of this stuff. Like, I guess just the way that they're going about approaching this seems less short term to me and more long term. Like, Theo is not probably the absolute best option for short term results, like showing up at the Long Beach Grand Prix. Um, to me, this is like kind of a tryout. Like, you'd stick Askew in the car. You'd stick
Agreed.
somebody who's driven a concurrent Indy car at these places before, if that's how if that was your approach. If you're just like, well, David's coming back in a month, or for the speedway or whatever, so we just got to like kind of keep the thing in the points and go rip off a couple, and none of this is either here or there, basically, for later in the season, or into next year or whatever. I don't think this is the move that you'd make. So to me, this is kind of like a test in its own right for Theo, just to kind of like get up to speed, for McLaren to take a look at him, to see how he gets on through the weekend, to work with the guy over the course of a race weekend. Um, I have no particular opinion on whether they'll keep him in the car as opposed to Callum for Barber. I would agree that one of the two of those guys is likely to be in the car at Barber. Um, and then they'll go from there. But I guess I have the general feeling, like, from the choices that they've even just made up to this point, that they're making driver choices on like with slightly more long-term thinking in mind.
Yeah, and I think the vibe, at least from the F1 paddock at the minute, it's obviously not a yes or no answer to the question, but Theo doesn't seem to be in contention for any of the Formula One seats for 2025. So he's going to be looking very, very hard at other options, I imagine, especially at this moment in time, as to where he might end up. So it's probably a good opportunity for him to get out there. And he had a bit of a nightmare start in his Super Formula debut as well. So he'll be looking to put some positivity out there, I guess, and just get behind the wheel again. So it would be interesting to see how he gets on, and for McLaren to evaluate him as well, because he's been a Sauber junior for basically his whole career, or at least the whole time that people have known who he is, and he's been competing in some of these like more reputable championships. So I think there's probably a bit of intrigue on McLaren's side as well to work out. Obviously he's a Formula 2 champion, but just how good is he? So there'll be some of that there as well, I think.
Yeah, I think just to actually circle back and answer your question about just what is this going to be like for him jumping in at Long Beach. I mean, the things that stand out to me right away as being particularly challenging aspects of just driving an Indy car for the first time, kind of in general, is it's going to take a minute just to get used to the tire, get used to the cold tire warm up, like all that stuff, which as we know is kind of a super critical part of actually producing lap time in qualifying in particular, is like kind of understanding that and getting it right. We've heard from a number of really like veteran guys that they're having to put a lot of time into kind of working on that. I guess the only caveat to that is it has kind of seemed like some of the European drivers, despite not necessarily being familiar with it, have naturally been pretty good at that. So there's a chance that standing out to me or us as something that's like difficult. Maybe Theo, like some other guys have, will just kind of have a knack for it. But with any race car, getting used to the tire and the brake pedal, like the brake warm up, basically brake and tire warm up, those two things together is like a trick. If that doesn't sort of click right away, that's something that will definitely get in the way of extracting performance. And then Long Beach is it's a short lap, so it's a little bit like St. Pete in that the lap times will all be pretty close together, but that doesn't help really in the context of somebody coming in and like having to get used to a lot of stuff. Like it's a difficult place that, from a setup and the way the car feels and kind of what you're doing one corner to the next, there's not like a lot of rhythm. So turn one is very different from turn two, which is very different than from like 3 and 4, which is different from 5 down to 6, 7, 8. Like it's just every corner kind of has its own nuance, and there's different pavements, and the curbing is different in a lot of different places around the track. So it's the type of place that, like, even a couple of days in the sim, which I'm sure he's getting prior to going to Long Beach, unlike a Barber or something like that. Like if we were talking about him showing up to Barber, he's got like a puncher's chance of just being competitive right away if the car is good going there, because it's easy to get into rhythm. And although it's still a difficult track, if you've done what he's done in his career, you've dealt with just figuring out difficult tracks, and you're good at figuring that out quickly. Long Beach is a place that I think that experience has ended up counting for a lot for guys there over the years, just because there's a lot of little things that it just takes a while to kind of like, oh, that was sort of weird. Like, or that's like different than it was last year, like, so now I got to kind of make this little adjustment to find that extra, couple of hundredths in this corner to stay in the top 10 throughout practice. And you know what I mean? Like it's a lot of little things. So I guess this is a scenario from my perspective that it's worth being super impressed with the guy if he's actually fast, because it is among the trickier places to show up and be good at. And I think it's not going to say much one way or the other if he's not, for the same reasons.
Coincidentally, I was trying to think of, because Long Beach is usually like the second or third race of the season in the IndyCar Championship, apart from 21 when it ran at the end of the season. It's kind of an unusual place where someone would turn up and make a debut, really. It's like kind of like, because it's like the second or third race of the season, you've usually had the drivers usually started the season. So I guess coincidentally, probably the most similar comparison you could draw is Callum Ilott in 21, because it was like his third race of him coming into IndyCar in the middle of the season, and the race being at the end of the year. And even then he'd had 2 IndyCar races under his belt. So totally, you can't even draw a comparison, really. I mean, similar levels of inexperience, but just having not even tested the car or anything yet for Theo, that's a big deal. But as you said, potentially a longer term look and a big investment as well for McLaren to get him in the simulator with Tony Kanaan, and to give him that level of that level of backing to go and do that, and to I know it sounds like such a lame thing to say, but just all like the arrangements of like kind of making that happen. It's not been done on a whim, has it? It's something that is clearly part of an evaluation plan to work out how good this guy is. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how he gets on over the course of the Long Beach weekend. I'm kind of interested in, obviously, looking at Long Beach. We're still quite early in the season. It's difficult to kind of pick out favourites or try to I don't want to kind of like butcher any storylines to this point, or try to make something out of that just isn't there. I'm kind of interested in Andretti as a team coming into this one. I don't know how you feel about how they go into Long Beach, but I feel like it's kind of like when you look at the end of a season, if you're Andretti, then you're probably looking at the likes of St. Pete, Long Beach as chances for you to bag big points. And that's, they're some of the places that are going to allow you to have those issues at some of the other races where you can kind of stomach the loss of points in those ones because you've bagged a load of points at the races you're going to be good at. But I guess specifically for Marcus Ericsson, he didn't score heavily at all with his issue in St. Pete. So I guess I'm kind of looking at Long Beach from the perspective of like, it's not by any means, it's not a make or break race for Andretti by any stretch. We're 2 races into the season, for God's sake. But the fact that you need to bag points at the races where you're good at, it does feel like it's at least an important one. And it'll be interesting to see if Kyle Kirkwood comes out as strong as he did last year, and just how that team is kind of working 3 races into a season, albeit obviously with only 1 points race so far. But I'm kind of feeling like that's the team I'm most interested to kind of have a look at and see how they're getting on this Long Beach weekend, Joe.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we've talked about this before, but it's all, when you really start to think about who's in contention for sticking car on pole here, it's like, well, there's like 5 teams that have somebody that can stick a car on pole here. So it's kind of hard to tell, but I'm sort of with you that basically, seeing if Andretti, all 3 cars, any of the 3 cars, I guess, seeing where those guys end up stacking up, because it for all kinds of reasons, the fact that Andretti had a dominant street course package last year. They won this race with Kirkwood last year. Colton's hauled ass at this place forever since I can remember, basically. I think that when it was 2020 or whatever, when it was the last race of the season, didn't he win that year?
2021. Yeah.
Didn't he come from like 14th, 15th on the grid or something and won the race?
14th, yeah.
And then threw it away the following year. So he's an obvious contender. And then Marcus had a lot of success at Long Beach also without being in that car. And so the fact that he was up to speed in the Andretti car as quickly as he was, and like kind of firing on all cylinders at St. Pete, all 3 of those guys I think are likely to be in contention. So the storyline there to me is like, does that actually come to fruition basically I think the question is like, does it come to fruition for all 3 of them? Like, it's possible that if the package that they have is really that good, that all 3 of those cars could and maybe should be in the top 6 if it's that, if it's like really that type of situation. So does that transpire? You've always got Dixon and Palou, and we're kind of waiting to see Armstrong and Lundqvist, like where do they sort of stack up at Ganassi. But I feel like the Ganassi thing is just there's been such a long history for like years now of that basic group of drivers, the Ganassi drivers, and particularly Palou and Dixon there, just like kind of flying under the radar and being super competitive these places, that it's almost not a story if they do. It's kind of like, oh well, there they go again. For me the other obvious, and I guess I kind of throw the McLaren guys into that same mix at this point, which is there's no reason why they shouldn't be competitive. It might come as a little bit of surprise if both Rossi and Pato are both like top 6 fast throughout the entire weekend, because it just hasn't really felt yet like that's where they're at. But again, like that wouldn't shock us if that occurred. To me, besides Andretti, the other real story is Penske, actually, given that they appear to be still kind of to be the lead Chevy team, basically, in terms of resources and general and like average competitiveness. That certainly proved to be the case, last year when it was all said and done. And sort of, if we're just to take the initial sample this year, that seems to continue to be the scenario. Newgarden, had they not had the fueling issue, was certain that he was going to win the race last year. And so I think between him and McLaughlin and Will, you've got a little bit of a similar situation to the Andretti guys, which is they might have a totally kick-ass street course package that is good enough for all three of those guys to like genuinely be in the hunt. And so I think that Long Beach can be a place where that is a little, like, certainly more so than St. Pete in terms of just outright pace. Like if your car is actually just really good at Long Beach, I feel like that I don't know. I mean, this is just my kind of general feel for the place, and I've experienced this in the car at Long Beach that more so than in other street circuits. There are times when you just really get the setup right, like you get the shock tune right, and it's like, holy shit, all of a sudden you pick up like a really substantial feeling of grip and pace. And that once that occurs, it's just like, okay, we got to just not screw up, basically. Most of the other street circuits, there's enough of a like it's enough of a guessing game just due to the conditions of the track and like the way that the court track evolves and the wind direction and all of this different stuff. And for whatever reason at Long Beach, it just seems like that's less the case. Like it's kind of like either you got it there or you don't. And I guess in general, it just strikes me that Andretti and Penske are the two groups that sort of seem most likely to end up in the situation where it's just like, oh damn, like they just got a little bit of a leg up on everybody. So those are the two I'm watching to check against that, basically. Like, is that what happens here, or or do we get somebody or another team that's kind of upsetting the apple cart and plays more seriously into the mix?
Well, Penske will be interesting because I guess this race fascinates me from a numbers point of view. There's all sorts of weird and kind of wonderful stats, or just like interesting kind of patterns going on here. And you mentioned Penske, like Will Power's won the race twice, but hasn't won it since 2012. And Scotty Mack was 10th last year, and that was his best result so far at Long Beach. And he's obviously been incredible at St. Pete. So you're kind of looking at those two guys to step up. But obviously Josef won in 2022, so he looks like the kind of guy who might lead that charge. And then Ganassi hasn't won since Dixon in 2015, I don't think.
Has it been that long?
Yeah, I don't think they've won since then, because we've gone backwards, haven't we? So we had Kirkwood, Newgarden, Herta, Rossi twice, Hinch, Pagano, and then Dixon. So yeah, 2015 Dixon. So
yeah,
it's been a while for them, and it'll be interesting to see. It feels like a lot of the teams that you mentioned also have like one driver who are the kind of standout, apart from Andretti, really. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. Anyway, enough of my number nonsense and thinking about who won the Long Beach Grand Prix, and you should get on with your day. So thanks for joining us on this episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Definitely go back and listen to our interview with Kyle Larson from last year, where we broke down his kind of feelings and spoke in depth about his Indy 500 bid, which is obviously now started. And check out some of our other backlog episodes as well. We had Josef Newgarden on recently talking about his epic start to the season in St. Pete, and obviously the thermal debacle, let's call it. You can go back and listen to our thoughts on that. And we're back with another points-paying race, a second points-paying race of the season. So we're looking forward to that. I'll be on the ground in Long Beach and looking forward to going there for the first time, actually, in person. So very much looking forward to that. It's going to be cool. That's all for this episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.